Hello, Garland Nixon here. It's Monday morning, and I'm here with the brilliant Dr. Radhika Desai. We're going to talk about the North Korea-Russia alliance. We're going to talk about that in the context of an anti-imperialist bloc. And we're going to talk about Russia hearkening back to the legacy of the Soviet Union. Let's talk. Hello, we have with us today the brilliant Dr. Radhika. I'm probably pronouncing your name, Radhika Desai.
Right.
Dr. Desai, I actually have you. Are you still at the University of Manitoba, or you just tell us what you give us your? Because I know things change. I know you're in London. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba, teaching political studies and political economy. And at the moment, I'm on sabbatical and I'm visiting professor at the London School of Economics, Department of International Development.
Wonderful, wonderful, and I am a big fan of yours. I especially I like your work with Michael Hudson. A lot of great stuff. Okay, let's go. So one of the things that I think is important to discuss in the context of the Russia-North Korea alliance is that it fits in a big puzzle. It's a puzzle piece, and the puzzle is, I'm not going to call it. It's interesting. The anti-Russia people said, "Oh, Putin wants to rebuild the Soviet Union." Well, that's one way to put it. They're forcing, or they've created a dynamic. I'm not going to say forcing. Let me do that a little different. They've created a dynamic where it appears to be in the best interest of the Russian government and the Russian people to reach back to the legacies of the Soviet Union, be it industrial legacy of production, be it diplomatic legacy of rebuilding an anti-imperialist bloc in Africa, etc., that it seems to be in their best interest, and they are certainly maintaining courses and speed on that journey, as we say in the boating community. Your thoughts on that particular part of the alliance that's being built in North Korea, between North Korea and Russia, in the context of this greater change and harken back to this Soviet Union legacy? Dr. Desai.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many different ways in which we can approach it. But let me first of all say that in terms of this treaty or this agreement that Mr. Putin has concluded with Pyongyang, what's really interesting is that on this trip, he went on a trip to Pyongyang and then he went to Hanoi. And that means he visited two socialist countries. And of course, this is in the context of how how Russia has been getting very close to China as well, which is the leading socialist country of our time. So in terms of its international alliances, there is absolutely no doubt that it's going closer to socialist countries. But there is also, this is not just that, okay, Russia is what it is. It's an oligarch-dominated capitalist economy, and it just happens to be getting close to socialist countries. I think there is an underlying logic that emerges from the war, but I would say that it also goes deeper than this conflict in Ukraine. So let me explain what I mean. So first of all, there is historically a deep connection between progressive socialist or socialistic policies and war. Think a very simple example. I'm sitting in London right now, in this country, which is essentially, it's approaching an election, and the big theme in the election is really there's no party to vote for. And the chief reason for that is that every major party has abandoned any commitment it ever had to the amazing society that they built after the Second World War. Because what happened during the war is, of course, the war itself required massive economic massive mobilization of people to go and fight for the war, mobilization of all those people, like women particularly, who were not going to fight in the war, or most of whom were not going to fight in the war. as an industrial army to work in the factories while the men were fighting for the war. The mobilization of all the assets of the country to pay for the war, which means that objectively, Britain was a top down planned economy. And towards as the end of the war became visible, people realized that now it's a matter of time. We have triumphed. It's just a question of how many times the rubble bounces, but the war is going to end and we will have won the war. Then people started saying, if we can plan to win a war, why can't we plan to end poverty, unemployment, illness, ignorance, ill health, all these things? So the welfare state was born, and Britain had one of the most generous welfare states. Health, publicly organized healthcare, free at the point of use. If you are ill, you just show up at one of the many doors that the National Health Service has, and you will be treated. Anyway, my point I'm trying to make is that war has that effect. War creates in the first place a socialized economy, and then when the war comes to an end, then people sort of say, well, if we can do this for war, why can't we do this to end all the miseries of human life? So there is an underlying logic, and you can see at the moment, now, that's one point I want to make. I want to make another point. Now, this directly refers to Mr. Putin and his attitude towards socialism and so on. Now, Mr. Putin is very famous for having made two statements. One is that the end of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical disaster. He's on record as saying that. The second thing he said is those who are not nostalgic for the Soviet Union have no heart. And those who want to bring it back have no head. So he's basically said, remember, he was a young man when the Soviet Union came to an end. He had already become essentially a career spy, actually, within the Soviet Union before it collapsed. And then, of course, he was an important part of the administrative apparatus in St. Petersburg, and then, he became president. But he carries that legacy with him. He has some conception of what it was like when it existed. But at the same time, he has, for the past, if one can criticize him, at least if I can criticize him for anything, although Russia has needed some kind of, after the horror of the Yeltsin years, after the horrors of shock therapy that were imposed by Western financial institutions on Russia, which led to the biggest economic decline of any country in peacetime. After all those horrors, you would have thought Putin would have said, let's bring back some version of the Soviet Union. No, he didn't do that. He has generally, even after 2014, when sanctions were imposed on Russia and the need for that, on the whole, he's done what was necessary. He certainly made Russia resilient in the face of sanctions. He transformed Russian agriculture. Today, Russia is an agricultural superpower. All that, great. But on the whole, he's leaned towards a neoliberal policy for the simple reason that while he got rid of the unfriendly oligarchs, shall we say, oligarchs who were unfriendly to him, he has kept in place essentially the oligarchs who dominate the Russian economy, and they have an interest in essentially maintaining links with the West, etc. And once the financial sanctions were imposed, even those possibilities had been closed. So essentially now what we are seeing over the last 2 years since the launch of the special military operation or war, whatever you want to call it, you have been seeing increasingly Putin bowing to the necessity of essentially engaging in economic mobilization. They want to fight a war that will remain legitimate in the eyes of Russian people, which means not suffering too many casualties, bunkering down for a long war, and ultimately wars are won. They say an army marches on its stomach. Wars are won by producing enough food, enough clothing, everything enough to supply the army, to keep it alive and healthy, and to let it fight. And that's what the Russians have done. Is the military sector, particularly of the economy, has gradually been transformed essentially into a kind of state control sector. And slowly and gradually, President Putin has also been introducing a number of welfarist reforms, which means that, essentially to solve problems of, unemployment, low incomes, etc., low pensions, etc. So things that he refused to countenance even like 5 years ago are now becoming policy. And certainly that means that Russia is being pushed in that direction. And I have no doubt that it will be pushed further in that direction. So here's my third point and my final point in answer to this question. And that is that, you see, historically, we have seen that, people say free markets is the best way of pursuing development. Actually, this is absolutely wrong. Free markets are surefire recipe of keeping a poor economy poor, right? Historically, when we look at the development of any country, whether it is the United States itself or the UK or Germany or Japan or Western Europe after the Second World War, their recovery and so on, in each of these cases, the state has played a central role in doing things like regulating capital flows, regulating trade, controlling and planning at least the overall pattern of the economy, if not every last detail. And so state intervention in the interests of interest of the country rather than in the interest of a small handful of capitalists, which is what you get in the United States, for example. State intervention is absolutely key to producing development. And I think that if Mr. Putin wants Russia to continue to advance his own rule to remain legitimate, etc., and Russia to be, as I said, Russia to advance economically, technologically, etc., he will have to further deepen reforms in the direction into which the war and history have forced him.
Interesting. Now, that's internally. Externally, let me say this. A while back, this was maybe 2016, 17, 18. I was arguing at that point that the U.S. was talking I was covering Latin America, and I said that, they're forcing an anti-imperialist bloc, and I was talking about in the global South, Latin America, et cetera, right? It appears to me that in going after the Russia and China, they forced an anti-imperialist bloc amongst the big boys, amongst the heavyweights. And Russia is really embracing this. I really think that Sergei Lavrov is an incredible diplomat, an incredible intellectual on the world stage. But notwithstanding all of that, certainly they make discussions, and President Putin, I would imagine, to some extent has the final word. I understand it's not nearly like the West puts it, that he just shakes his fist and everyone does it, that there is a collective decision-making process in Russia, but he has, final say. Okay, that being said, this is a big thing. This is a big step. I'm sure you've read, I've read this military alliance. My understanding is that China already has a military alliance, you talk to me about that, because if that's so, I've looked and looked, if that's so, then what you're now saying is, if you attack China, if you attack North Korea, China already has a mutual defense pact. Now Russia has a mutual defense pact. If you attack China, North Korea already has a mutual defense pact, and Russia's just, one, millimeter away from being involved. It creates a dynamic where the three of those are now inextricably linked should a military aggression from, some unknown power occur against one of the three. Your thoughts on this anti-imperialist, all that stuff?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So first of all, let me say that this new treaty between Russia and the DPRK, North Korea, represents a major step forward in the consolidation of what Russians like to call the world majority, or whatever you can call them, the rest, not the West, but the rest, etc. That is to say, there is or some people have been calling the axis of resistance whatever you want to call it. But there is a definite anti-imperialist alliance that is forming, and this represents a major step forward. And one of the things as well is that, North Korea is in a very interesting position in the larger configuration of things, at least until this treaty it was, which is that historically Russia and China have always been aligned with North Korea, but they have gone along in agreeing to about a dozen or so, or maybe less, maybe 10, 8 to 10 series of sanctions of the UN Security Council, which cannot be imposed without the agreement of Russia and China. They have been imposed on North Korea because both, as nuclear powers, both Russia and China have wanted to contain North Korea's nuclear ambition. They basically don't want more countries having nuclear weapons and, essentially queering the pitch, let's put it that way, as far as their concerns. And by the way, I'm not saying that Russia and China have themselves, plans, devilish plans to use nuclear weapons. On the contrary, they have always been on the side of reducing and eventually eliminating nuclear weapons. But proliferation only makes all this process more complicated. But anyway, so they have done that. But with Russia and with Russia making this agreement with North Korea, what Russia and partly they've made this agreement because they feel that they must go along with the West, at least to some minimal extent. Now, China has, of course, got a legacy treaty going back to 1961, and Russia has now recreated this treaty, more or less, going back to 1961. So that's the first point. And that means that Russia basically is thumbing its nose at the West, because at the moment, Russia is in the eye of the storm created by Western sanctions, Western aggression, you name it, NATO expansion, etc., which is destabilizing the world order. And by the way, these actions are also destabilizing, but the destabilization is all the greater because the West is not succeeding. It is meeting with resistance, which is successful resistance. So Russia has basically decided it doesn't care about the West. It's going to make an alliance with North Korea. Now, what is the content of that alliance? The content of that alliance is, I would say, at least as important economically as it is militarily. So militarily, people say, well, actually, if you read the text, people think a defense alliance means it's that, like sort of like the Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. No, that's not what any military alliance that I know of is about. This one also, it basically says that should one of these two countries be attacked by a third power, they will immediately consult, and then out of that will emerge some kind of a mutual aid set of agreements and actions. Fine. And quite frankly, NATO, there are huge misunderstandings about NATO. If you actually read Article 5 of the NATO treaty, it does not say that it is incumbent on every one of these, whatever it is now, 30 plus countries, to go to the aid of any one of them if it is attacked, because quite frankly, it's not going to happen. There are some of the NATO countries are so tiny, nobody's going to lift a finger if these countries are attacked. But so they are there for some other reasons. What the NATO treaty says is that every country will decide what to do in order to help. So, if I'm the leader of one of them and I decide that I'm going to send them one helmet to help them, that's it. That's my decision. I've just done that and I'm finished. My NATO obligations are done. So this is no different. But I think that the real objective situation is such that the leaderships today of China, North Korea, Russia, they all understand that they are in the same boat. China to a lesser extent, but certainly Russia and North Korea are militarily in the same boat. And I would say that the incentives for them to help each other are enormous. And that is a surer guarantee that the two will act in concert in any future Western attempt to threaten them or to invade them than any piece of paper, which no matter how ceremoniously it is signed, because a treaty can always be abrogated. The treaty can always be violated, whereas their common interests will continue to exist for a long time, as long as the West remains aggressive. And quite frankly, if tomorrow the West started, if Jill Stein or Cornel West were elected president, then they probably won't need this treaty. So that's good. Anyway, so that's the second thing. And the third thing I wanted to say is that actually I would say that economically, I think that this treaty is far more significant. I would say, and at the moment they say that, even after mobilizing the economy, the Russians still need to import ammunition. We are told that they have imported ammunition from North Korea last fall, and since last fall they have done so. So fine, maybe they need that. I'm not so sure, but I'll let's say that has happened. But most importantly, Russia is now an agricultural superpower, and that means that North Korea, which has had difficulties producing food, not because they don't have a well-planned economy, but chiefly because of sanctions, they will not have that problem. And the key point, I would say, in the treaty is that Russia is saying that the sanctions being imposed by the West are illegal. That therefore, by calling them illegal, they reserve for themselves the right to break the sanctions. And and then also remember that there are a number of times in the treaty there is mention made of being in keeping with the United Nations Charter. Now, the United Nations Charter is, the United Nations is often criticized because, the way in which it is conducting itself has become too much prey to US influence and Western influence and so on. But now, but at the same time, the UN embodies the very principles for which these countries are fighting: respect for sovereignty, non-interference in your external affairs, etc. So the original principles of the United Nations are still valid, and they agree that they are valid, that they abide by it. So I think that they will consider themselves free to violate what are unilateral sanctions, and probably, if necessary, also violate in spirit, if not in letter, any UN sanctions if they need to, for example, for economic reasons, etc. Because I think in some of the coverage I read, at least one of the sanctions imposes a requirement not to allow an increase in the number of foreign workers that North Korea sends abroad. So one person pointed out that, well, so what? What Russia will do is allow thousands of students to come and study in Russia, and who is to complain if they go and work while they are studying, etc. So they may do things like that. But I think that this means that, North Korea's isolation is finished. And that's, to me, the most important thing coming out of this. And yeah, so.
That being said, that also is another important point in the end of unipolar hegemony, such as it's claimed by the US, such as it is claimed, and such as they have a lot of people convinced that they have. Okay. There's certainly a discussion to be had about whether they ever had it, but whatever you want to call it, we cannot deny that the U.S. had immense power in the U.S. and the ability to influence. Number one, they controlled the international economic infrastructure, whether it's the SWIFT and all this other stuff, so they could use that to really twist a lot of arms. But North Korea was a big one. We've got them under our fist and nobody dare touch this. Iran got them under our fist. We're starting to see people grab those fingers and loosen them up. That's as the ability to invoke severe economic sanctions on countries and strangle them, is starting to go away. To me, North Korea is a very important point or node in that particular change of things. I suspect Venezuela's next. One of the things that I read, one more thing I'll throw in, and I think this is critical. The apparently one of the things that one of the requirements that Russia's in the process of inserting into BRICS countries is that you have to agree in order to join BRICS or be a member of BRICS that you will not participate in unilateral sanctions against any other members of BRICS.
Interesting.
Go ahead. Your thoughts on that particular perspective?
Well,
All the
I
way
mean,
to
I think that, yeah, I mean, actually, that's really interesting because, of course, not participating in sanctions means that you will refuse to impose the secondary sanctions that come out, the extraterritorial jurisdiction that US assumes when, when the US imposes sanctions, it says to third countries, so let's say US imposes sanctions on Russia, but it also says to the Europeans or the Africans or whoever that if you trade with Russia on these points, you will be responsible for, we will consider you as violating our sanctions. And that sort of behavior, that means that countries that join the BRICS must be able and willing to stand up to such pressure. That will be quite an interesting thing to consider. But let's come back to sanctions and North Korea and so on. Now, there is a enormous literature on sanctions, and I've been sort of dabbling in it here and there. And one of the things that you notice very early on when you start reading about what's been written by scholars about sanctions is that there is a interesting debate. One literature is about the huge the catastrophic effects of sanctions. So sanctions have the effect of depriving a population of food, of medicines, etc., and they lead to deaths, and so on. In all these sorts of sanctions, we have seen the effects of these sanctions around the world. So there is the literature on the effects, but then there is another equally voluminous literature. And so the effects are very big and very bad. But there's an equally voluminous literature on the effectiveness of sanctions, and that is essentially nil. No matter how poor the country on which sanctions have been imposed, and on the idea that somehow, what can they do? They will ultimately succumb. They will ultimately change their regime. The Cubans will overthrow the communist party government, and Venezuelans will overthrow the Bolivarian government, and so on. And Iranians will overthrow the revolutionary government there, etc. None of this has ever happened. Sanctions may be painful, but in fact, it has, generally speaking, made people even more determined to oppose them. Even the model of sanctions we are supposed to have dates back to the days when Britain imposed a military blockade during the First World War. Britain and the Allies imposed a military blockade on Germany. But in fact, although it cost Germany a lot, there is no evidence that this contributed in any significant way to German defeat. So in that sense, the effectiveness of the sanctions is out. It's not on. So the US keeps imposing sanctions, quite frankly, because they do not have the capacity to control events. So sanctions are a way of saying we are going to control events. Maybe not today, but tomorrow this will have effect, and so on. So it is part of the apparatus of maintaining the appearance of US power when in fact the reality of US power is rapidly dwindling. Now, North Korea is really interesting as well, because if you remember under Trump, there was a big flurry of activity around creating a better relation, essentially coming to a new agreement with North Korea. And just around that time, at that time in Korea, we had a president, in South Korea, we had a president who was committed to improving relations with the North. They were even saying to the United States, please call a formal end to the war that you have against North Korea, etc. And we want to make progress. We want to make progress towards unification. South Korea has a ministry of unification, of reunification. So they are constantly at work. But at the moment, like at this point in time, the US has a very, very pro-US, anti-North president in power. Back then, they did not. They had somebody who wanted to work for peace. So there was that circumstance, plus the North Koreans, defying all the sanctions imposed on them, developed a missile that could reach the mainland of the United States. And that put the fear of God into the minds of the American administrations, and they managed to convince Trump. And who knows, Trump thought that maybe if I manage to pull this off, they'll give me a Nobel Peace Prize, which of course they tend to give US presidents. So Trump went in for it. In the end, he, of course, being he completely destroyed the negotiations and so on. But nevertheless, this did not come to pass. But the reason why the so sanctions never, in fact, sanctions have brought North Korea closer to challenging, despite sanctions, rather, North Korea has advanced a great deal in coming very close to being a real threat to the United States. And I would say that this is to their credit. So again, that's partly why I say that militarily, actually, the North Korea has what it needs. It's got the big bazooka that says to the United States, if you do anything to us, we are going to launch one of these on you. And is even losing Los Angeles or San Francisco worth the, should you even risk that in order to try to change the behavior of North Korea? This would be, that would be it. So to me, this treaty is significant. I'm sorry, the sanction situation is that they have not been effective. They've certainly not been effective against Korea and against North Korea.
One of the interesting things, I'm going to mention this. You mentioned Trump. I had something interesting happened to me. I went to and this was a peace thing at a Asian culture, particularly Korean cultural center in Philadelphia. I was one of the speakers, a peace event. Okay. And the people that were running it were pretty lefty left, they were pro-socialist at minimum. Okay. What was interesting when as I heard the different speakers, they were all going to vote for Trump. And the reason they were all, and there wasn't a discussion of he's a good guy, he's a bad guy, I like his policies, I don't like his policies, whatever. It was, I have family at home. All of these people were connected. And their concern was, as I say, what do people vote for? WIIFM, what's in it for me? Donald Trump tried to get and they knew the details. It was incredible. Well, on this date, he did this, he landed here, he went here. And then they went into John Bolton coming in saying, hey, you don't want to end up like Gaddafi, the machine coming in, throwing a monkey wrench in it. They sending John Bolton to Mongolia, afterwards, the whole 9 yards. But it was interesting because, Donald Trump is what Donald Trump is. And he's not the kind of guy that you'd expect the person of a revolutionary nature, shall we say. But when it came down to it, they were concerned about the safety of their family at home and any kind of hope that they could get for a resolution they were looking for. And also another thing, I didn't realize this. They talked about how intense the propaganda is in South Korea, the US empire, from elementary school, they're giving them propaganda about the evil North Koreans and the evils of communism and blah, blah, blah. That basically, it helped me to understand that South Korea and these other countries, whether it's Australia or Japan, that they are Philippines' pure vassal states. And that the US just brainwashes the people. Anyway, your thoughts on that? That's an experience I had. I'm not going to interpret it for you. I was surprised. Your thoughts on that experience? How do you interpret it?
Well, my understanding has been that there remains to this day a very strong lobby. In fact, the majority of Koreans want unification. They do not wish their peninsula, their country. Because remember, Korea is actually a tremendously, Koreans have great pride in being Korean. They don't want Koreans to be divided between two countries. It has been a remarkably cohesive culture going back a long way and so on. So in that sense, I feel that my understanding is, and I've only been to Korea a couple of times, but my understanding is that there is a huge majority in favor of unification. But the West, as you rightly point out, they continue this campaign of sanctions, and they don't actually tell you that this is what Koreans actually want. They try, so in the Western, you don't hear this very often in the Western propaganda, but I'm actually not at all surprised because, at the end of the day, a peace movement, what is a peace movement? A peace movement arises because people are afraid. of dying. I don't want to die in a nuclear war. Why should any South Korean or North Korean, for that matter, wish to die in a war that is actually not of their making? The partition of Korea is basically a result of American attempts to supposedly fight communism. And unfortunately for it, the United States actually did not succeed in this. It had to accept the division of Korea. It had to accept defeat in Vietnam. And yes, though the Soviet Union disintegrated, and that's a whole new can of worms that we can open if you want, but the Soviet Union may have disintegrated, but it did not disintegrate. It disintegrated for its own reasons, not because the West won against the Soviet Union, not at all. The Soviet Union disintegrated because at some point a section of the leadership, which was not even a majority, but a section of the leadership that had lost all commitment to socialism, ended up wielding sufficient power as to start a process. And then once the process got going, it was uncontrollable. And as you know, for example, just to give you one example of just how contrary to, we are told that the Soviet Union was disintegrated because of some kind of broad uprising against the Soviet government. This is not at all so. The Soviet Union disintegrated in late 1990, 1991, and earlier that year, a referendum had been held about whether they wanted the Soviet Union to be preserved. And the overwhelming majority of the Soviet population, 80%, voted no. They did not want the Soviet Union to be to disintegrate. And the leaders of Russia, that is Yeltsin, Ukraine, and Belarus, simply took it upon themselves to sign an agreement saying we dissolve the Soviet Union. And that's how it was dissolved. And at that time, Yeltsin was very much the West's man in Moscow. So,
well, let me ask you this, because if I am the Russians, certainly, and others, but let's just say the Russians, I'm looking at Ukraine, I'm learning everything I can from the Ukraine, etc., right? But I've put it this way, that the U.S. has evil twins and two wars, that the Gaza conflict is a mirror. In both instances, you have one group who wants to believe and is convinced that they are intellectually and culturally and everything else superior to the other group, whether it's the Eastern Ukrainians or the Palestinians. You have the U.S. supporting a very a radically reactionary political regime that's violent. You have both of them are rapidly becoming a military and economic burden to the U.S. in that both of them are broke. Neither of them have an economy anymore. And the U.S. is now has to prop up both economies indefinitely, because I don't see any of these economies waking up. And internally, the U.S. is dealing with, in the instance of Ukraine, at minimum, people are saying, I'm sick of all of this money going over there and my situation's falling apart. In Gaza, people are saying, hey, this is a genocide. This is unacceptable. So if you're the Russians, if you're the Chinese, and you're looking at these twin debacles, you have to look at them from various perspectives. What do you look at these two very similar debacles? What do you learn about the U.S. empire, the state that it's in, the state of the world, etc.? You're one of the leaders of Russia or China, whatever. You're looking at this. What do you learn from these two conflicts?
Well, first of all, I mean, Russia and China they're very differently positioned vis-a-vis these conflicts, because China, of course, is not one of the countries being attacked. I mean, you see, China, Russia is in the conflict over Gaza. I mean, Gaza, Ukraine, and Taiwan. There are some similarities in all of them. So, obviously, in all of them, Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan will be in the same position, which is they will be fighting the proxy war. So just as the United States wants to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, it will try to fight Iran to the last Israeli, and it will try to fight China to the last Taiwanese. right? So that's the situation. So essentially, it is the United States seeking to, and in the meantime, of course, the Gazans, the Eastern Ukrainians, and whatever bit of China they eventually attack, they will be the sort of the casualties in all of this. So, and obviously, I'm not trying to dilute the suffering of Gaza, which is absolutely obscene and not. But if you were to make this analogy, that's what it would become. So, if I were sitting in Beijing right now and looking at these conflicts, I would say, well, if they, the United States has already provoked Israel against Iran, has provoked Ukraine against Russia, and tomorrow it will provoke Taiwan against us. And all the time it will pretend as though the other party has done the provocation. So, the West keeps repeating that, Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. No, I mean, first of all, there was no war that was not provoked. I mean, no war has been more provoked than that war. But there's another thing, and that is that, it's not just provocation. I mean, people say, I remember till the, in the run up to the February 24, 2022, I was convinced that Putin would not be provoked, because it was obvious that the West was trying to provoke Putin. And in the end, I thought, oh my God, he got provoked. But actually, I have heard a senior person in Russia say to me, no, that's not what it was. The West was convinced that Putin would not do anything, that Putin would take all the West's insults. And it's essentially its refusal to acknowledge Russia's security. Because remember, they were engaged in that complex process of trying to come up with a deal in which Russia was saying, look, you acknowledge our security interests, you accept that you will behave in a way that respects our red lines, and everything will be fine. And they drew up a couple of different draft treaties to say, if you sign this, everything will be fine between us. And the West refused, and they thought that Putin would simply take it lying down. And so this guy says to me, no, Putin decided not to do that, and decided therefore that he would now go to the defense of the at that time Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and then eventually this was extended to 2 more regions and so on. But nevertheless, that's how these things happen. So if I was sitting in Beijing, that's what I would think, and I would prepare for the eventuality that that the United States will try to do this. The United States has not succeeded. It's not going to succeed in the Middle East. It's not going to succeed in Ukraine. But that does not mean it will not try, because the United States has a long list of military failures behind it. And it still keeps essentially attacking other countries through proxies. And there is no reason why it's not going to do that today. There is one, I should say, you mentioned the issue of money, and Israel and Ukraine being bankrupt, and the United States having to the whole there's all this complex. And Michael, you mentioned the show that I do with Michael, Geopolitical Economy Hour, that I do with Michael Hudson, and we discuss the issue of so-called de-dollarization a lot. And the term de-dollarization has too many different meanings, and in fact we are probably going to do a show on that. But the point is that, and many of them are very confused, but the key is that there are many internal contradictions to the dollar. Remember that in the late 1960s, when at the height of the Vietnam War, the United States dollar system was in absolutely acute crisis. The Europeans were up in arms with it. They did not want inflation to be exported. They were saying, keep your dollars, we want gold instead, etc., etc. And by 1971, the dollars linked to gold had to be broken. So and that was really a moment of great crisis for the United States. And I think we're approaching another such crisis, because the fact is that the United States, assuming it has this exorbitant privilege to print as many dollars as it likes, actually does not have that privilege. And the dollar market is only being held up because the Federal Reserve is intervening massively in propping up the market for US securities, for US treasuries. And I think that eventually, somewhere, and of course, all US asset markets are massively inflated. So somewhere there will be they are ready for a crash. So whenever the crash comes, there is going to be a big a crisis of the dollar system. And so the US's ability to keep supporting these countries is in question, just as the US ability to keep financing the war in Vietnam was in question back then.
Wow. Let me ask you this, since you are in London, I did want to ask, I don't want to, I know we're talking about North Korea, but I think all of these things we're talking about are related. This is one gigantic, I mean, it's the collapse of an empire that has its tentacles all over the world. Okay. And an economic infrastructure, political infrastructure that has turned Europe and all of its allies into complete vassals, subservient vassals. Okay. European elections happen. Now, everyone talks about the far right one. Well, for that starters, the far right in Europe is very different than the far right in the US. Number of reasons. Some things in common, some things different. But if you look at what's happening, we've got a similar issue in the US and throughout its vassalage, in that it captures both parties, and it's, as they say, six in one hand, half a dozen in the other. Oh boy, we're going from the Tories to Labor. Oh boy, we're going from the Greens to the SPD to the, whatever, right? Okay. Your thoughts on this is what I think. This can't go on. There has to be a pushback when you have the ruling elite who not only have gone so far from representing the personnel, as Annalena Baerbock said, we're going to do whatever we want. We could care less if the German people like it. When they get to that French Revolution level where they just sneer at the voters, well, this foolishness about democracy and representation of the voters, we don't have time for that illusion anymore. Okay. You have an election, and then you set it up, and then they vote, and then they get Keir Starmer, and they get even more of what they were getting, right? At some point, this thing has to come to a crash. Your thoughts on European politics and the direction you see of a completely captured political class, that the people have no hope for independence and sovereignty at that point, which sounds to me like at some point explosion. Anyway, your thoughts.
Yeah, the unpopularity of Europe's political class, the whole political class, it doesn't matter which party, the entire political class is being discredited, has been discredited. And as a result, for example, in France, Macron, essentially by edging out both the right and the left, he sort of occupies, he is essentially the political establishment. And in the recent European elections, that option was rejected. And that's, now he's called a snap election, hoping that everybody would somehow come to their senses and say that, the right and the left are too, because at the moment what's happening is a polarization in France with Mélenchon and Le Pen essentially polarizing French politics. And Macron probably thinks that, well, everybody will wake up and realize that these options are too frightening, and they will come back home to dear Emmanuel. Well, it's not happening. It's not going to happen. And I would say that, in general, the unpopularity of, Olaf Scholz suffered a terrible defeat. Here, by the way, just one other detail in the UK, as well, while it looks as though, there's going to be it's possible to have an exceedingly ironic result in this election, so that it's quite possible in this election that there will be a Labour government elected with the biggest majority ever. Bigger than the 1945 landslide, which brought Labour to power, etc. But that will not be because Keir Starmer has some bright and shining program to present to the people that people love. It will be because, although the people have hardly any hope from him, the Tories have made such a mess of the economy, of COVID, of everything, of the infrastructure, of the government's finances, that everybody is fed up to hear, and they will vote for him. Mind you, there could also be some very, very complex other sorts of results. I mean, maybe Keir Starmer will not get such a big majority, but anyway, this is one of the possible outcomes. And of course, Olaf Scholz has suffered a terrible defeat as well. But okay, so normally the unpopularity of Europe's ruling establishment is connected to two things. One is the unpopularity of the Ukraine war and the inflation that they are suffering. But I would say, and they're generally linked. People think that the inflation was caused by the Ukraine war, so etc., etc. In reality, I would say that the two are actually linked to something rather different. This is the two are both of them, the inflation and the Ukraine war, are the culmination of decades of neoliberal policy. And what do I mean by that? Neoliberal policies are generally assumed to be a kind of creating a free market policy. You create free markets and competition. No, that's not what neoliberal policy is about. Neoliberal policy has always been about allowing big corporations as much freedom as they like, giving them subsidies, favoring them outlandishly so that they end up controlling your economy. Because they are monopoly corporations, there is no pressure on them to innovate, to reduce costs, etc. And because they are monopoly suppliers of most things, they can charge whatever they like, so that a large part of the inflation actually comes from that. And moreover, these corporations, because they can make money so easily, they have no incentive to invest and create jobs, which is the main reason why we are told we ought to put up with capitalism. Is that, look, capitalists create jobs, so we should, they're at least good for something. No, they're not even doing that. And the same class is driving, is feeding the dogs of war. It is driving the dogs of war. The same classes want war so that they can try to distract the people. They can make profits in the armaments industry. They can make profits in many other industries as well as a result of these wars and so on. And to me, the West is living in a time, because of course the American elections are also coming up, and they are going completely haywire as well. So we are going to see some really interesting outcomes, precisely because at the end of 40 years of this neoliberal crappy policies, we are seeing that societies can no longer be controlled. But at the same time, our governments, instead of trying to improve anything, are simply doing the bidding of a small number of big capitalists who are, driving, whose inaction is driving inflation because they are not investing, and whose actions are driving the war.
Okay, I want to ask you a question again. I haven't had you on before. I hope to have you on again soon. But different things I've been thinking about, and I really want to get your spin, because not spin, get your views, because I find your views unique, and they cause me to rethink some of the things that I have thought in the past. Okay, Israel. In the United States, here's the discussion. Who's in charge? Is Israel is the tail wagging the dog? Is Israel in charge? Israel drags the United States around and makes the US do whatever it wants. So there's a discussion as though there's two separate nations, and one of them is controlling the other. Which one? Okay. Or Israel, Biden and Netanyahu are having a fight, and one wants this and the other wants this, right? Now, that's one way to look at it. My perspective is, that's like saying my elbow and my fingers are having a fight.
It's very much
my
like
elbow, my brain is having a fight with my fingers. My fingers do the bidding of my brain, because the only separation of my brain fingers and my brain is verbal. You can only separate them using words. In reality, there's one entity here called Garland, right? And so we can verbally separate his fingers and his brain, but there is no separation. To me, Israel is part of the U.S. empire, a critical part of the U.S. empire, so much so that the U.S. empire is damn near willing to throw everything overboard, because if they lose that military outpost in the sea of oil, in the lifeblood of international industry, game, set, and match for the empire, and they know it, and it's too late. They're trying to hold on to something that they've already. Anyway, your thoughts, go on. Let me get out of the way.
No, not at all. I actually completely agree with you. So first of all, let me say that I think what you're thinking is absolutely right. But let me add two other interesting elements to what you're saying, two interesting corollaries to what you're saying. So, tail wagging the dog argument. This is typically takes the form of, the Israel lobby, APAC and all that. So, APAC exists. And let me say that I have absolutely no doubt that APAC is very strong. It is very powerful, and it certainly makes sure that a lot more Congress people and other members of the US political classes stay on side, stay on message as far as Israel is concerned, than would be possible without it being there. So I have no doubt that it is powerful. But I would say that even if APAC did not exist, as you rightly pointed out, Israel is part of the US imperial structure. The US's strategy, such as it is, it's not a great strategy, but the US's strategy, such as it is, requires Israel to be present. Israel is the US's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the region. It allows the US to do what it needs to do in that region. So in that sense, the tail wagging the dog argument isn't quite true. I'm sure that the tail is trying very hard to wag the dog, and it maybe even wags bits of the dog, but not the whole dog. So that's the one thing. And that dog is wagging a lot, and it's wagging because it's got its own purpose, its own imperial purposes in the region. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would want to say is that, Israel is definitely part of the US imperial structure, but by pushing the envelope as far as it has, and maybe Israel was also fated to do so. Maybe there was no other way for it, because it is itself such an untenable entity. Because essentially, Israel was created by displacing a pre-existing people. Now, you could say that if they had not been pushing the envelope, if they accepted the limits of their situation and made an agreement on a viable two-state solution, created amity with a Palestinian state, etc., or at least some measure of cooperation with the Palestinian state, they may have continued to exist. But today, after pushing the envelope as much as it has, Israel itself has become an unviable proposition, it seems to me. This is increasingly beginning to be recognized, is that essentially it has created such a powerful right-wing force within Israel that wants everything. Netanyahu showing that map at the United Nations in which Palestine does not exist. This is a murderous fantasy. And what's more, it is not going to succeed. Israel is trying as we speak. It may have murdered as many as 1 in 10 of the original population of Gaza on the 7th of October. But it's still not going to succeed. Hamas is still fighting back. Now it is provoking Hezbollah. So there is a sense in which, this, and as I say, maybe it was impossible for Israel to be governed without creating such a powerful right wing that will not take anything else. And so you have this, an immovable object meets an irresistible force. I mean, this is going to be really messy.
I certainly, yeah, it's already messy. And ultimately, I look at that. And again, I keep looking at these things and one after the other, where I say, Ukraine, the end is obvious. Russia's going to win. It's on Russia's border. Russia does have, no matter what they do, these terrorist attacks or whatever, the end is obvious. The Russian military, you go to the border. This is the way I put it. You go to the border of a superpower to fight, you're going to lose every time, because they've got all the advantages. You go to the border of Russia, to the border of the US. If you go to the border of a superpower to engage that superpower, you are going to lose every single time. And so that's obvious where that's going to go. And in fact, my argument in the long run, my prediction is this: when it's all said and done, the Ukrainians aren't going to be mad at the Russians. They're going to be mad at the US. Yes. And they're going to say, my God, you threw us in the cage with a bear, knowing we were going to get mauled. Look at what's happening. And of course, the US is going to do, as I say, they're going to exercise the Samsonite option. They're going to get out of there and they're going to leave. And the Ukrainians are going to be sitting there saying, what happened to food? What happened? You guys were supposed to be helping us. There will be but one place for them to turn. And they'll look at the Russians and say, we're starving. Can you bail us out? That's my prediction there. Israel. how long can they keep up this farce, pretending like they're in a war? They're not. The U.S. is in a war. They're proxy. They're no different than the neo-Nazis Azov battalion in a lot of ways, but they're no difference in that they're just being given weapons, go out there and get slaughtered, and go out there and lose. Everything's falling apart. They can't possibly, you know what I mean? It's over. So, and they've got an election at home. It's really the same dynamic. Joe Biden, really? You're going to put this guy, you know, everybody's watching next week saying, can this guy do a debate? He's wandering around aimlessly for no apparent reason most of the time. They've got dynamic after dynamic where there is no way for them to get out of it, where they've entangled themselves in a disaster with no plan, and there couldn't be a plan to get out. Anyway, this is the last part of it. So I know we're running out of time, but your thoughts on that dynamic that has repeated itself all over the place. I could go to economically. Same thing, but at any rate, your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're talking about the US elections, and it seems to me that as far as Israel is concerned, anyway, it probably doesn't matter who wins, because as we know, historically, Trump has been as enthusiastically pro-Israeli as has Biden been. I mean, Biden, of course, has a long record of being pro-Israel and so on, but Trump also proved to be quite pro-Israel. So in that sense, I think that perhaps the only thing that Trump might do is perhaps, require the Israeli government to, I don't know, fulfill some US conditions before helping them. But I have because it's very difficult to say what Trump's agenda will be. Trump's agenda will be governed by, when Trump was first elected, we had no idea what his agenda would be. He got elected sort of, railing against all the policies that had made all the big corporations rich. But the moment he was elected, they all began circling their wagons around him. He did deals with all of them. And in the end, he essentially did not change US policy by very much, other than by fingering China. He said to the US working people, he said, I know you're suffering, but you know what the reason for your suffering is? Not the 40-year+ history of neoliberal policy. It's because of China. And so I'm going to attack China for you, and that's why you're going to love me. And so on. So, I mean, I think that this time around, I don't see that the Trump's ability to essentially secure enough corporate friends to do favors to is, he will do it again. So.
Well, Dr. Desai, thank you very much. Certainly appreciate it. That was a fantastic hour, and I hope to have you back again soon. Where can people, if people are looking for, I know you do work with Dr. Michael Hudson, if they want to see more of Dr. Radhika Desai, how do I pronounce that?
It's Radhika Desai.
Radhika? Like TH? Does it sound like TH?
Yeah, exactly. The, as in the apple. Radhika.
So it's Radhika.
Yeah.
Yeah. Finally. Okay. And where can people find more Radhika Desai online?
Yes. So our show, Geopolitical Economy Hour, that Michael and I do generally have Michael on it, is on the Geopolitical Economy Report website on a regular basis, and it can also be found on YouTube. If you want my website, it's radhikadesai.com. And if for those of you who are so inclined, if you Google me, you'll find lots of stuff. So it should be available. Yeah.
And everyone, let's not forget to stand up for the one and only Arundhati Roy.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I've got a lot of books, and this was really, believe it or not, this little booklet here, Public Power in the Age of Empire, was very powerful in my development and understanding politics. So we know that she's right now facing some difficult times. We know that the Modi people are after her. Did you have a comment on Arundhati Roy in support, or whatever the case, before we go?
I think that, and we should probably, if you want to talk about the elections in India, by the way, there's a lot to talk about. And I've just been writing an analysis of the elections. So we can talk about that. But basically, Modi has been humiliated by the voter. The voter has said to him, we don't think you are such, everybody thought he was the world's most popular leader and so on. And the voter has pricked his bubble. So now this is his way of kind of trying to show that I'm still really big and strong and I can take off my most prominent critic. So he is basically slapped her with a lawsuit, choosing one of the most prominent people. And you know, to Arundhati Roy's credit, she has been a consistent opponent of the Modi government, of its fascism, of its policies towards Muslims, of its policies in Kashmir, and in on many other counts. So you know, she has certainly got a big badge of honor, and this is of course why Modi is attacking her.
Well, Modi and India better wake up, because from Ukraine to Taiwan, well, what do you know? India is rising as a world power. Perhaps Kashmir, the Kashmir region, needs democracy. Perhaps they need to be armed and turned into a, what do they always say, into a porcupine strategy. They'll do the same thing with the Kashmir. It is so clear and obvious that Ukraine and Taiwan and eventually Kashmir becomes, we've got to give them some democracy. The Indian government is doing this or that against them and must be... I don't know. At any rate, thank you very much, Dr. Desai. Thanks a lot, everyone. Don't forget, you know, I am somewhat banned, shadow banned, all that stuff. So people have been doing a great job of sharing my videos on all their social media platforms. Follow me on rockfin.com. Follow me at Rumble. Just in case I wake up on a given Tuesday and they say, Garland, you're no longer on YouTube, everyone will know where to find me. Thank you very much.